welcome once again to the Alumni Special. I'm Dilly MacFarlane, and in the coming weeks I'll be talking to many Mount alumni who are involved in interesting activities, and today my special guest is Heather Watts. Welcome, Heather.
Thanks, Dilly.
Heather graduated from the Mount in 1982 with a Bachelor of Arts in History, and according to our recent conversation, I gather that you put some of your schoolwork to good use when you graduated.
Well, I never could see doing all that work on a term paper and not getting a lot of mileage out of it. So
you have in fact done that.
Yes, I did with a number of my term papers.
Okay. We're going to be concentrating later in our conversation on your Silent Steeds project that traces the history of the bicycle in Nova Scotia. But I understand that you have also compiled booklets on a couple of other things that are local interest.
Yes, one was an old house in the south end of Halifax. It now belongs to the Unitarian Church, and I had always wondered how old this house was. No one seemed to know a great deal about it, and so I did that in one of my social history courses. It was most interesting, tracing the families that had lived there, the architectural development of the building itself, which was particularly interesting, and we traced it back to 1825.
Marvelous.
And it has now just been declared a provincial heritage property, which pleases me very much.
Well, that's great, because I'm sure that some of your work was instrumental in gaining the status, was it?
They used, yes, some of the research that I had done.
Fantastic.
So it was very...
This is the Unitarian Church on Inglis Street.
Yes, it's an old house, 5500 Inglis Street, a double house. Many people will probably have noticed it.
Now, you're a resident of Williams Lake, aren't you?
Yes, I live in the suburbs, and that was another one of the local history projects that I did, was tracing the history of that area around Williams Lake and the Northwest Arm, that side of the Northwest Arm.
I see. Now, how did you go about getting this information in print and available to the public?
Those two booklets on the house and on Williams Lake I published with the organizations, the church and the Williams Lake Conservation Company, that were interested in them, and we published them privately, but they were quite popular, yes.
Are they still available?
The Williams Lake one is, the church one is out of print now.
I see. Now, I understand that you do some speaking locally on the Williams Lake history and so on, to school children and
yes,
that sort of thing?
One of the parts of local history that I always found really very interesting and which interested other people were the photographs. I used to spend many hours in the photographic library at the public archives, and I made many of these photographs into slideshows so that I could go to local groups, church groups, or the Williams Lake Conservation Company, the Heritage Trust, to talk about these topics and to illustrate them with the old photographs that I found really very evocative of the period.
Well,
and
sure.
I have talked to several of the school classes in Spryfield and Jollymore on the history of that area.
I see. Now, you had mentioned to me earlier, before we began the show, that you gained a great deal of expertise, both through your history program, which you studied here at the Mount, and also through the museum studies work that you did while you were here.
Yes, one of the classes I took was Mary Sparling's Museum Studies, and it was a most fascinating course.
Yes,
and
sure.
It was sort of out of that I went to the Nova Scotia Museum with this idea, and they were interested in using the history of cycling in Nova Scotia as a topic for a summer exhibit. And Silent Steeds became, the history of cycling in Nova Scotia before 1900 was their summer exhibit last summer at the Nova Scotia Museum.
That must have been very exciting for you, Heather.
It certainly was.
I bet.
I worked with them for 6 months on the preparation of the exhibit.
I see. How did your interest in cycling, where did that come from? Where did the idea come from?
Well, it was really through my family. I'm afraid I'm not a very athletic person, and all my family were madly riding bicycles, and I had to have something to talk to them about. 1982 was the centennial of the Canadian Cycling Association, and so they said, go on, and you like doing local history, go find us some stories we can use for publicity material during centennial year. So reluctantly I went off to the archives, but not really expecting to find anything on bicycles. I didn't think that anyone would have kept this. But once again, I found these wonderful photographs, some of which you'll see in a moment. and it sort of grew from there.
I see. Well, let's take a look at some of these photographs. I understand that we're going to be starting looking at a period in the development of the bicycle in Nova Scotia, starting in the centennial year in 1867.
Yes, the first bicycles that came to Nova Scotia were called Velocipedes, and this is a sketch of a Velocipede riding school. They had these, many of these in Halifax. It was a real craze around about the year of Confederation and the couple of years following Confederation. They had these schools where you could go and learn to ride so that you didn't disgrace yourself on the public streets. You could
What a
learn
great
in private
idea.
first. They called them rinks. There was also one, a school in Lunenburg and one in Liverpool. The craze spread very quickly throughout the province.
Now, are these the sort of penny farthing type?
No, this is the forerunner of the high wheel bicycles,
see.
which people call the penny farthing because of the
Right.
relative size of the front and rear wheels. This is a Velocipede. The wheels are more equal in size. The front wheel is a little bit larger. They're very heavy. They had a cast iron frame, and really those are just like cart wheels. The spokes are wood, and there's a flat iron band that rims the old cart wheel. So they're very difficult to steer. They're pedaled by direct drive on the front wheel. The pedals are attached to the hub of the front wheel, and they were heavy. They were difficult to
A lot of strength
steer.
required,
Yes,
yeah.
and women, of course,
Mhm.
couldn't ride them. This is actually the earliest photograph I have of a bicycle in Nova Scotia. This is Willie Ells, I think, is supposed to be who it is, but we do know that he was in Tuscot, and it's quite a dark picture because it's an old tintype. It's a copy of an old tintype. That is a Velocipede that he's riding, watched by the local children.
Hmm.
And this is one of the Velocipedes that we had in the exhibit. There are two existing in Nova Scotia, both in the Annapolis Royal area. This one was brought first to Granville by the Amberman family, and it's now owned privately in Annapolis Royal. It's a lovely little machine.
I see. So after the Velocipedes, we move on to the high wheel type
Yes.
cycles.
The technical development that it was occurring was that people wanted to do away with some of this weight. They wanted a bicycle that could go faster and be easier to steer. And what happened was that the front wheel began to grow because the larger the wheel was, the faster you could drive with this direct drive on the front wheel. So the front wheel of the bicycle got bigger and bigger, and to balance it, the rear wheel became smaller, so that a man could devote all his strength to getting right over the hub of the front wheel. And that improved the speed tremendously.
Now there is a good size front wheel.
Now this man is really the father of cycling in Nova Scotia. This is Clifford Shand from Windsor. Many people will know the latest of the Nova Scotia Museum's branch museums, the Shand House in Windsor, and that was his home. But he was an early cyclist in the Windsor area, and later on he became chief consul of the Maritime District of the Canadian
I
Wheelmen's
see.
Association. Very
Interesting.
influential cyclist. This is the Halifax Club, a group of high wheel riders, and you can even see a safety bicycle or two, one of the ones that looks like our modern bicycle in there, taken in the public gardens.
Oh, that's lovely. Now this said would be around, what, 1880 or so?
Yes, the high wheels were popular during the 1880s. The slide that you just saw and this one were taken around 1889.
This is a particularly interesting slide, and I would like you to tell our viewers why it is so interesting.
Again, we're in a transitional phase. The technology of the bicycle developed very, very quickly. You went from the Velocipede to the high wheel. The high wheel was very popular for about 10 years, and then it gradually became, or rather not gradually, but quite quickly became superseded by the safety bicycle. This is when chain drive came in, when they went away from direct drive to the front wheel with the pedals coming right out of the hub of the front wheel, and they went over to the sprocket and chain, which of course enabled the bike to be smaller and safer, lower to the ground. You could go much faster. You weren't dependent on the wheel size for the speed that you could achieve. And, of course, very important, women now could ride.
I see. Is that a woman I see leading the parade?
This is the first picture I have of a woman cycling in Nova Scotia. This group includes the high wheels at the back, the low safety bicycles at the front, and right out of the, leading the group is the first woman that I've got cycling in Nova Scotia.
Wonderful.
Picture.
Well, this is an interesting gentleman, I understand.
It was very common in the 1880s and the 90s to bring your bicycle right into the photographer's studio and have your picture taken. They were very expensive, and the owner was usually extremely proud of them. This is Robert Cutler of the Halifax Ramblers Club with his new bicycle.
Now that looks like a bike that you could get at Canadian Tire.
It's
or
very
Simpsons or
yes,
Eaton's.
it's very similar to our modern kind of bike, except you can see on the front wheel there are footrests sticking out from the front fork. They didn't have a free wheel mechanism, so if you were coasting downhill, those pedals would be going around very fast,
yes.
and you had to get your feet out of the way.
I see. You mentioned that he's a member of the Ramblers Club, and I think that what we're going to see here now is the former meeting place of the Ramblers Club.
Yes, they owned the music pavilion here at Princess Lodge for many years. If we had a magnifying glass on that little arch over the path that goes into the clubhouse, is the legend Ramblers Cycle Club.
Very interesting. Oh, love at first sight, of course.
We often think that Massey Harris used to make tractors, which they did, but before they were making tractors, they were making bicycles. And the Ramblers Cycle Club sponsored a big cycle show in Halifax. And Massey Harris was one of the many kinds of bicycles that was exhibited there, and women who went there and discovered that they now made bicycle frames that were drop-downs to accommodate their skirts, realized that they too could ride and could enjoy all the fun that their menfolk had been having, and it wasn't long before women were really enjoying this sport.
Now, this is a shot that I think is taken at a place that I'm familiar with, in Parsboro, Nova Scotia.
Yes.
And any of our viewers in Parsboro that could identify some of these individuals, we probably could drop me a line and let me know who they are. It looks like a lovely outing. I know the Parsboro people always have lots of fun, and that looks like a particularly fun day, doesn't it?
This looks like quite a fashionable group, too. The kind that might have been looking in Eaton's catalog and wondering whether they could afford to buy the very latest in bicycle fashion, which this lady is demonstrating.
I see.
But it wasn't only the most fashionable. I think the next slide will show us that ordinary people also were.
Oh, yes. These would probably be clerks or secretaries, perhaps, riding to work, maybe.
It could be, or just out on a Sunday afternoon spin. No, I shouldn't have said Sunday afternoon, because they didn't approve of Sunday riding. It would have been Saturday afternoon that they would have gone out.
Well, Heather, I'm sorry to say that it seems as though our time is just about gone. But before I thank you and say goodbye to you, could you let our viewers know how we can obtain a copy of Silent Steeds, Cycling in Nova Scotia to 1900?
Silent Steeds is published by the Nova Scotia Museum, and it's available at the museum for $3.95, or it should be also in all the local bookshops.
I see. And your other brochure that's still available on the history of Williams Lake?
That is available in Pair of Trindles at Historic Properties.
I see. You're going to come back and speak to us again about your projects in local history.
I'd love to do that.
Oh, that's great, and I want to thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget Silent Steeds. It's available locally, composed and put together by our own alumna, Heather Watts. Again, I'm Dilly MacFarlane. Thank you for joining us this week on the Alumni Special, and inviting you to come back again next week for more of the same. In the meantime, if you have any comments or suggestions as to our programming or future program suggestions, please write to me in care of Mount St. Vincent University, where we'll be broadcasting to you next week here on the Alumni Special.